I have two big topics I want to talk about. I'll bring up one now, and maybe I'll bring up the other later. The first one I want to bring up now, and I think it's going to be relevant to a bunch of the stories you raise, and this is the issue of how to frame conversations about energy. This is a topic I'm very, very big on because I believe that the framework of a thought process or conversation, which is the starting structure from which it begins, that influences everything else. And in general, I think that we operate on a framework that's very biased and sloppy at the expense of fossil fuels and nuclear, and that ultimately leads to very, very bad thinking. Now, the fundamental thing I think needs to be at the beginning of any discussion in one form or another is the idea of what's our standard? How are we measuring good and bad? So if we're saying we're arguing about or we're talking about what's a good or bad policy toward fracking in Colorado or fracking in Ohio or building this pipeline, ultimately when we're talking about is this a good idea or a bad idea, we have to have some definition of good or bad, some standard by which we're going to measure or evaluate things as good or bad. And as I've talked about many times, my standard for that is what I'd call human flourishing, which is human life being as good as possible, really in every aspect of life. And that's ultimately the right standard. But recently I've been experimenting with a different way of discussing it that I think better captures what needs to be captured to frame a discussion. And I'll just preface this by saying sometimes when I talk about human flourishing, people think, well, does that really take into account the environment? Does that take into account the climate system, the ecosystem? And I'll say, yes, it does, definitely, because those are parts of human flourishing. But nevertheless, people sometimes tend to detach it. And on the other hand, when we talk about environmental issues and environmental quality, as I've discussed on previous episodes, I think people think about that in a very wrong way because they think of an environment just as our non-human surroundings. And so people don't think of environment in terms of things like buildings and roads and things that we ourselves build that actually make our surroundings much better. So when people talk about, oh, something's good for the environment or bad for the environment, they're excluding all of the positive human things that we can do to our environment. And those turn out to be the most decisive things. So I don't like the way when people talk about environment and then also, but when I talk about human flourishing, sometimes people think I'm ignoring things about environment like air quality or water quality or climate. So this leads to what I've found to be a very effective way of having discussions. And I'll give you an example. I was on a podcast of sorts or a YouTube thing maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it was about a potential terminal in Oakland that would, among other materials, that would carry, among other materials, coal. And what I said at the beginning of that interview when I was asked, what do you think about this? I said, well, there are a lot of things that people are discussing here, but for me, there's one basic question. And it was, will Oakland be a better place to live if we build this terminal or if we don't build this terminal? And I really like that wording of, will Oakland be a better place to live? And of course, if you're talking about a global thing, you can talk about it more broadly. Like, will the earth be a better place to live? Or will Colorado or will Ohio be a better place to live? So the formula is basically, will X place be a better place to live if we do Y or not Y? Y is a policy. So it's like a certain place and a certain policy. And what I love about this framing, and I've been playing with it with some initially really good results, is it really captures the idea of what I call the human environment, which is that we want to live in a world that's as good for human life as possible. And that includes certain non-human things being in a certain state, and then, having air and water, et cetera, being good. But then also having certain kinds of infrastructure and really all kinds of values that we create that are good. Because ultimately what makes a place good to live is the total of the environment that we live in the very fullest sense of the term. So what I like about this expression, does it make X a better place to live or a worse place to live, is that's a really relatable kind of terminology. it's people understand, oh, I understand what it means for, say, Detroit to be a better place to live. And I can see, oh, Detroit was made a bad place to live by certain kinds of things. And it could be crime or pollution. People have a very holistic sense of human flourishing as it relates to our environment when they talk about a place being a good place to live or a bad place to live. And so it really captures many, if not all, of the dimensions we want to consider when making a policy, versus when people talk about environment, they very narrowly just are thinking about what are potential negative human impacts. And that always leads to a distorted decision. So for example, if you take one of these fracking discussions, people will say, they'll talk about fracking and environment, and they'll only think about ways in which fracking could make, quote unquote, the environment worse. And then even if there's some very dubious thing about groundwater, which is very unlikely, or some very far-fetched claim about cancer, people still think, oh, well, on balance, it's still negative. Let's be safe. And if you talk about, oh, will fracking be good for the environment or not, they'll say, well, let's just be safe, right? Let's not do anything. But if you say, will allowing these projects make Colorado a better place to live or a worse place to live, that then summons the whole impact of those projects on every aspect of life. And then you start to see, oh yeah, that groundwater thing and that cancer thing, those are totally exaggerated. But what we're missing is all these ways in which this project is going to make life better, including all the ways in which it's going to make us healthier. It's going to make us wealthier. We're going to be able to afford better food. Our hospitals will work better. We're a lot actually less likely to get sick and die, among other benefits, if we allow this industry. So I encourage people to just, when you're thinking about issues and when you're talking to people, try talking about it in terms of, will this policy, it could be the Green New Deal, like, will the Green New Deal make America a better place to live or a worse place to live? I think if you focus it that way, people are going to start to see, oh, wow, I can totally see how this policy, which trying these completely far-fetched experiments and having our whole grid and transportation system rely on these failed technologies, that could make America a terrible place to live. And then they'll integrate that with the kinds of climate things, and they'll say, yeah, this is not actually going to, what is this going to do for CO2 levels, and how is that really going to benefit me, versus what it's actually going to do in terms of its really significant impact is it's going to make your life worse. It's going to make, if passed, it would make us a lot like Venezuela, which I think we're going to talk about today. So I find that very helpful. Any thoughts from you guys on this? Because I know you guys also get into a lot of conversations about things.
I mean, the thing I like about it is, one of the things I found just generally with clear thinking and persuasion is there's this quality of, like, once you hit on the right notes, everything feels obvious, even if it's very controversial at the headline level, right? Like, the moral case for fossil fuels as a headline is something that people kind of say, wait, that doesn't make any sense. But when you read the book, there's this quality of, it seems very obvious once it's pointed out that we should think in an even-handed way, looking at all the alternatives in a pro-human way. And like this sort of formulation, it's something very, you put it as relatable, but part of what it does is it makes the issue feel much more obvious, versus kind of struggling to prove something and it feeling like I'm going to, beat you into submission with my string of facts and logic.
Interesting. Yeah, it's when we talk about looking at the full context or the full impact of something, that when we talk about how does this impact whether a place is a good place to live, it just automatically takes that into account. So I really like the practice of trying to find out what in the vocabulary and thinking of people already is an example of good thinking, and then how to leverage that, because it's a lot easier to leverage something that people are already doing well than to try to create a whole new thing, although that can be useful too. Stefan, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I particularly like to take the big picture approach, which will also be relevant to all of my stories today. So often, even if you have a lot of factual knowledge, you often lose sight of the bigger issues and relationships. So, if you have a relative risk, you can get all the facts right and still get the wrong impression about, how significant is this particular risk in a certain context. to your overall life risk or your overall health or whatever. And I find it very useful to get clear on what is the big picture impact of every single like fact.